Shalom, everyone. It's good to see you. And I'm Rabbi Nico Socolovsky, and I have the privilege to once again share this space of stories from the beginning, this time with Rabbi Kavod Wieder, the Rabbi of Temple Bethel in South Orange County, and with Rabbi Daniel Levin, who is the Senior Educator for Hillel and also a Rabbinic Fellow at TVT. So this week we are going to be speaking about Parashat Vayeira. But before we get into Parashat Vayeira, how are you doing, guys?
Doing pretty well. You know, just as we were kind of chatting before, I think it's worth saying for me, this is a week off. And so much of the time, you know, as a pulpit rabbi, we're preparing, we're learning Torah and studying Torah so that we can share with other people. And given that I'm not required to be at the synagogue this Shabbat, this kind of Torah study that we're able to share and learn is really lishma. It's really for its own sake. And I definitely notice a different experience for myself that's just about connecting with the heart of our tradition, not to teach it necessarily or not to, but just to be with it and to be with you guys in it. So I'm really grateful to be here.
Yeah, there's a discussion in the Talmud that I always think about with this parsha in particular about whether or not you finish the Torah every 1 year or every 3 years. And it's always parshiot like this, where there's so many different narratives that you just want to spend the entire week discussing each one, that I'm like, would have been nice if we went with the 3-year thing. It would have given us more time to discuss each and every story.
Nice. I know if I will be tonight at the Solomon Society event. I'm quite excited about that. So glad that the men's group of the federation get together this time in person. So it's nice to have that opportunity. And also the Solomon Society does so many good things. So I'm really excited about tonight. And one more question. So this is the month of Cheshvan. What are you doing? Yes, Cheshvan. So what are you doing for Cheshvan? This is the eventless month. So are you doing something special during this month?
Well, this last couple weeks for me has been just a little bit of time of more introspection and more ability to slow down a little bit, which has been nice.
Yeah, the same. I mean, it's been interesting for two reasons. I mean, one, it feels like this is really the first, if there's such thing as a normal month, this is the first quote unquote normal month in a year and a half, because it seems like COVID ended, or COVID started tapering down right before the summer, which is always sort of an odd time on the calendar anyway, especially vis-a-vis Hillel. And then we jumped right into the Chagim. And so this is the first time where it's like, okay, yeah, this is what I remember a normal quote unquote week to be like.
So the reason I was asking is that we at TVT, we use the opportunity of having this month without Chagim, without holidays, in order to do a mitzvah day. And I'm thinking about this Torah portion. I think this is one of the first Torah portions in which mitzvah doing, like the performance of mitzvot, shebein adam lechavaro, between fellow human beings, is very clear, it's very real, becomes very real. And it might be with this idea of bikur cholim, of visiting the sick, that mitzvah that is performed by God at the beginning of the Torah portion. So Parashat Vayeira, the meaning of the word Vayeira is to be shown, to be seen, to appear. And the Talmud says that after 3 days of being circumcised, God decided to cover Abraham's tent with sunlight in order to prevent him from seeing out and from looking out, so he would take the time and rest. And so he decided to send his servant, Eliezer, to seek for travelers, for wayfarers. And Eliezer comes back and says, I didn't find anyone. And so Abraham decides to to stand up and to look by himself. And so he goes out to the entrance of the tent, and then he sees God, who is coming to visit him and to perform the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, of visiting the sick. Now that's the first part of the scene, which is Abraham coming out and then encountering God and being visited by God. And then you could see, if you are seeing that picture, that Abraham and God are kind of sitting together and enjoying each other's company. And next scene is Abraham recognizing that there are three strangers coming in their direction, and he decides to run toward them. And then the rabbis ask, like, how is that possible? How it can be that one will leave the divine presence in order to go and welcome the travelers? How is it possible that one will lose his attention when interacting with the divine presence, so one is able to recognize the stranger? And I think that the most beautiful idea at the very beginning of the Torah, this Torah portion, is quite the opposite. If you really, really, really want to embrace the divine presence, you need to be able to look beyond. You need to be able to recognize those that are like beyond your nose or beyond your reach. So what do you think about that?
You know, it makes me think about, what do we mean when we're talking about being with the divine presence? You know, and in this case, what's interesting is, you know, we had Vayeira, that God appears to Avraham, but speak to Avraham in the same way that he does in the last parsha, like Lech Lecha, like go for. He just appears. So there's this experience that Avraham has that is, that's not with words, but with presence. Mm. And I wonder if somehow that presence is not separate from the people, the angel, whatever it is that appears. And in fact, you know, so much of the commentary talks about these not just as people, as angels, which in some sense, malachim are messengers of God. So I wonder if there's not an actual shifting from Avraham sitting, being in the divine presence, and then leaving to go be with the angels, but instead the angels are another part of that divine presence. And what that kind of brings for me too is, you know, this sense of what is Abraham's faith made up of? You know, is faith about being religious, you know, obeying, doing what you're supposed to do, like what the Torah says that you're supposed to do? Because in some sense, Abraham's challenged because he doesn't necessarily do what he's supposed to do throughout the Parsha. One of the things that Avraham does is he makes feasts and he invites people. According to the Midrash, he is constantly, when it says that Avraham plants an eshel, you know, like a tree or something like that, what Rashi brings is this piece from the Talmud that Rav and Shmuel have this difference between what is the eshel? Is it a orchard or is it a hotel, like a place for lodging? And in a sense, the idea was that Abraham plants the eshel is more about Abraham was constantly, you know, creating a hotel space where people would come, and even that word eshel is said to be an acronym for achilat, shtia, and levaya, eating, drinking, and then accompanied the guests on their way. So in a sense, like, and what was Avraham doing? It wasn't just about welcoming guests, but the Midrash is also that he was causing the guests to be so inspired by God's presence that they called out the name of God. You know, and this was people who were, you know, part of Israel, not part of Israel, all the places of the world. So he was in some sense radiating, speaking about whatever happened at his lodge, at his feasts, were all about awakening people to that presence of God.
So I want to interject that idea back to this idea of running toward these three strangers. I'd like to say something about that in a moment. This idea that God's presence is not fixed in one place. Right? Like if God's presence was right now sitting with you, at the gate of your home, now when you go somewhere else, or when you recognize a different situation in your life, maybe God's presence will be in that place. And we try to keep sacred things in very specific places, in very specific definitions. It makes us feel more comfortable. And maybe one of the first ideas in this Torah portion is that we are in the search of God's presence, and that God's presence is a motion. And it moves from one place to the other. And maybe the way of the man of faith, of the person of faith, is to have that ability to move between places and recognize God's presence in different places and in different individuals. Now, regarding these angels, just one comment. The Talmud says that they are Mikhail, Raphael, and Gabriel. So Mikhail, who is like you, O God, who's going to bring faith and the announcement of the birth of Isaac. We will talk about Isaac later. Raphael for refuah, for healing, because Abraham was in need of healing as he was recovering from his circumcision. And Gabriel, Vura, for the mission in the city of Sodom. So in order for Abraham to have the courage to undertake that task that he was given by God.
Yeah, you have this sort of meta question that I think runs through really this week's Parsha, but the entire story of Avraham, which is, why was Avraham chosen? Because there's nothing clear in the Torah of why Avraham was chosen. The first time he's engaged in really any substantial dialogue, God is calling out to him. And you sort of get these two dual narratives that I think really complement each other from the Midrash. One is Avraham as sort of the iconoclastic thinker or philosopher, the one who, sort of rises up in his father's house and smashes the idols. And you can almost get one sense of Avraham as this sort of deep theological thinker that started to split from the mainstream philosophic discourse. But the Torah doesn't end there. And I think the Torah is very clear that the point of Avraham, who of course ends up being an exemplary representative of the entire Jewish people, the point of Avraham doesn't stop at philosophy, right? The entire story of Avraham is actually seeing him carry out the end goal of that initial philosophic premise. And I think it's this 1-2 punch with Avraham, where you both have the philosophy, you have at its root core this idea of ethical monotheism, but Avraham starts there. He doesn't end there. And I think that's a crucial distinction, because all throughout the earlier Parashiyot in the Torah, we have other figures who clearly were on the same page of monotheism. We know Adam and Eve talked to God, Cain and Abel both talked to God, Noah talked to God. It kind of seems like everybody is having a relationship with God. But it was only Avraham who actually then took that next step and said, okay, I have this core belief of ethical monotheism. I firmly believe that the divine presence, that God can be found in each and every human who's created in the image of God, an extremely novel concept for 4,000 years ago in the Iron Age. And then he actually took that next step and said, well, what is a life going to look like living constantly with this precept? And what could I then do for both me and my descendants that'll set us up in a situation that we can constantly be practicing and fulfilling the precepts of this concept of ethical monotheism?
Daniel, that's awesome. I mean, that looking at Avraham, why was he chosen? Because of that second step, also, not just the first step, where he was able to go through. And I'm thinking again about kind of that famous rabbinic commentary that compares Abraham to Noah, right? Like Noah walked with God, but Abraham walked ahead of God. And it's kind of like, what does it mean to walk ahead of God? In some ways, it's to have that God awareness that we were talking about in Vayeira, that philosophy, that sense of presence, but then to be able to move forward with it and actualize it in the world in a way that God maybe didn't even imagine, in a way that was unprecedented. And, in talking about this idea of Abraham giving these feasts and kind of putting this forward, this gets challenged by this midrash by the rabbis, which says that that Satan, the testing angel, remember Satan is not a devil or something separate from God, but just another one of God's holy messengers that's there to test, that's there to in the same way that when we want to build muscles, where we have resistance and we press against it to do it. Satan is like that resistance. You want to grow, let's push against this. And Satan actually says to God, Abraham's doing all these feasts, makes all these things, but this is from Sanhedrin, when did he ever offer a sacrifice to you, God? When did he ever, and in some sense, Satan is almost saying, Avraham, maybe you shouldn't have chosen Avraham because he's doing all these feasts. He's bringing all these people to God, but you never asked for that. That was never something that was, and so he says, why don't you test Avraham and tell him to sacrifice his only son, and then we'll see where his heart really is.
Yeah, this is actually one of the most interesting things I think about the Jewish interpretation of the Educator, just going off that midrash, is the Educator in some ways is almost the clearest ethical story in the entirety of the Torah. There's no conversation, there's no dialogue. It's sort of Abraham saying, here I am. And then, of course, that's then taken in Jewish tradition to be the most complex ethical story, where you have midrash after midrash.
Let's just say that Educator is the binding of Isaac, for those that might not be familiar with the Hebrew. Go ahead.
Yeah, the legacy of the binding of Isaac within Jewish commentary ends up being taken apart to be the most complex story, with some midrashim, some rabbinic commentaries trying to explain that this was a type of test because of Abraham's actions. Others actually equate it to a punishment. I think one midrash actually says that it was sort of Abraham's quote unquote punishment for sending out his other son, Ishmael, as if God says, if you're willing to do that with one of your sons, how far are you willing to go with the other one of your sons? And so we take this, I think, story that could be read in a really moral binary way. I mean, the story could be taken to conclude the only thing that matters is faith and nothing else. And Jewish tradition goes a 180 and goes in the exact opposite direction and uses this as a perfect case study to really tease out the dialectic between belief and moral ability and moral rationalization. And you see that being discussed in the commentary.
If I can freeze for one moment the Kedah and go back to the story that Kavod shared, and I really want to do that because your story, Kavod, struck me for the first time. I think about like the power of insecurity, like this need to test Abraham out of insecurity. And when we let our insecurity, even when we're in a position of power, right, God, and we allow our insecurity to lead our decision making, and how complex that can be, and going back to what Rabbi Daya said earlier, in terms of the Abraham as being the one who is able to bring morality to the world, right? Like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says that Cain failed the test of moral responsibility. Am I my brother's keeper? With that question, and then Noah, by not asking questions, failed the test of collective responsibility, and Abraham is going to be the first one who passes the test of moral and collective responsibility, and we see that actually in an act of defiance of the divine, when he says, we don't need to kill all these people. We need to find a different way. we can kill the evil, the wicked, with the good people. There should be a different solution, and he argues with God. Now, I think that first, a part of exercising moral responsibility has to do with defiance and challenging definitions and asking questions and asking and challenging our own insecurity and sometimes our own instincts. And just an interesting thing in terms of numbers, when they go back and forth playing with numbers, how many people he needed to find in order to save the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, they get to the number 10. And in that context, 10 is not just a number in our tradition. 10 is what you need for a minyan. It's the foundation of community. It's the foundation of what can bring a community to elevate itself together. And I think that 10 also refers to restorative power. To say if we have a little community, if we have a little group, we can bring takana to this corrupted society. Like we can bring rectification to this corrupted society. And I think that in that place, we see that Abraham not only has faith in God, he also has faith in humanity.
Yes, nice. That's really nice, Nico. And also, I'm just, our conversation, there's so much that's swirling around faith in God, faith in humanity. What you said, Daniel, about faith being kind of the second step also, like faith is not just, an inner experience, but actually realizing it and doing something. And then what's the place, you mentioned insecurity in relation to the Midrash about Satan, Nico, and I'm thinking about where does that place of insecurity for faith? And, I was thinking a lot about this Midrash and reading about it as well, of that, why did God give in to Satan's, need for the test? Who was the test for? Was God? Because God has already chosen Avraham. God has seen already so much about Avraham and how he stands up, how he walks before him, how he does all of this thing. And it's almost like, I forgot where the comment came from, but Satan's test wasn't for God, but it was for the rest of the world. That the rest of the world would look at Avraham's feasts and the ways that he was in some ways kind of a missionary for God, and a way that he reached out to people and was totally in relationship as bringing them close, and said, the other nations of the world are going to look at this and not necessarily believe that this is about service of God, that Abraham's feasts were an actual enactment of his faith. Instead, it's compared to, who was the other big in Tanakh, the big feast that we had? It was Ashverosh, right? Ashverosh made this feast as the Purim story, which was all about every person fulfilling their own desire. I think that's what kind of the opening lines say something about that.
As Lucifer, right?
It wasn't about, right? It wasn't about sharing. It wasn't about helping people connect to something greater. It was a self-centered thing. And so it was almost like the test was Avraham needed to go through the Akedah so that people would also be able to see that his relational action in the world was not disconnected from the one.
Wow, that's tough. That's like that's such a. It's like the Akedah is a PR act.
Yeah, in this line of thinking, yeah,
it's terrible. it's brilliant, but terrible.
It's almost like there's one interpretation of the Akedah and faith that I think fits really nicely with this. I think if we sort of zoom out and view this as a wider metaphor for what it means to have faith in something, whether it means to have faith in a traditional religion, God, human relationships, even a career path or a life purpose, there's this idea that I think is introduced in the beginning of the story that to have faith means you need to have some sort of sacrifice. And a lot of commentators note the word in Hebrew, Isaac, means laughter, right? Really, it means joy. And so at the beginning, whenever you're sort of standing at the precipice of doing something that requires a leap of faith, again, whether that's an interpersonal relationship, whether that's a next step in a career, whether it's a total pivot in life, you're looking at it from the beginning and you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to require me to sacrifice everything. I have to sacrifice my happiness. I have to sacrifice everything I care about. And then as you go on that journey and as you actually start to go through the motions, and once you're willing to make the sacrifice, that's the exact point when you realize that it was never really a sacrifice to begin with. And I think it's in that distinction that Avraham learns that I think really gets passed on to the entirety of the Jewish tradition, is that from the outside of something, it seems like an impossible sacrifice. And then once you're actually in it, once you commit yourself to something higher than yourself, the idea of that even being a sacrifice in the first place dissipates. And at the end of the story, at least according to one stream of thought, you can imagine Avraham going down the mountain, truly now understanding that his allegiance to this new idea called Judaism doesn't actually require him to sacrifice everything in the end, as long as he's living it out to his best ability.
Wow.
That's very redeeming.
I mean, yeah, in some sense about that, I resonate with everything that you're saying about sacrifice, that it feels like something impossible at the beginning. And then once you make your commitment to it, you find yourself in the middle of it and it becomes a real authentic exercising of your faith. And it doesn't feel that anymore. I think probably why the Akedah story is the most challenging one in this is that I can't imagine if I want to really say that being a deep person of connection and faith in God actually means being somebody who's so deeply human, who feels so much his connection with other people, which is how I hold that. I can't imagine at any point in that Akedah all the way up to when God said, stop the knife. I can't imagine Avraham finding himself in the middle of that and really in some way, not having any tension anymore. I can only imagine that it was so excruciating for him right until the end. And so that doesn't take away from what you just shared, Daniel, about because I feel the truth in that about sacrifice and taking that story. But I guess maybe what the story challenges us in is, maybe the idea is thinking about what is the most difficult thing that you could imagine being asked to do. And the idea is that it's not about compromising your own humanity, but it's a way of pointing you in the direction that sometimes you're going to have to be asked to do really difficult things in life. And how do you respond to that? That's
so beautiful. I want to bring two ideas. The two ideas that you are bringing. One is the idea of the sacrifice, and the other one is what are you willing to sacrifice, right? That you are somehow bringing. Kavod. I just want to maybe share a mystical and an organizational idea. Last idea I have to share, and it's this concept that we first see Avraham in this Torah portion in the context of Sodom and Gomorrah, bringing up an act of defiance. And at the end of the Torah portion, in the Akedah, in the binding of Isaac, he doesn't ask questions. So to the question, did he pass the test? My personal opinion is not. He didn't. He didn't pass the test. And he didn't pass the test for the simple reason that he wasn't willing to ask anymore, that he wasn't willing to argue anymore. And I think that the enterprise of humanity starts by creating a creature that has free will, that has the ability to defy, that has the ability to ask, that has the ability to challenge. And when, at the end of this Torah portion, for the sake of the role that he was fulfilling, he forgets or he can't see anymore his primary role as a father, not as the father of a nation, and not as a man of faith in God, but as a father of a child that was in front of him. then he's almost not anymore a creature with free will. Now, who are those creatures without free will? Well, there's another character in this scene that is a creature without free will. It's an angel. Angels, they have no free will in our tradition. And I think that the human role of Abraham is ending in the moment of the Akedah. And what the Torah, this is my personal reading, and what the Torah portion is telling us is that also roles of power, roles of change, roles of remarkable human beings, of admirable human beings, sometimes need to come to an end, and we need renewal and renovation. I think that we see that in this moment, in this Torah portion that is about appearing, that is about seeing, Vayeira is from the verb lirot. Abraham can't see anymore, and therefore he concludes his role. And that's the moment in which we start with Isaac.
I want to challenge that, Nico.
Didn't expect you to do any less than that.
In that I actually think for a lot of what the ideas that you were expressing, that actually the Akedah was a huge growth moment for Avraham. And the reason is, if I want to take like a psychodynamic perspective, there's a reason why Avraham was not a good father. There's a reason why Avraham was willing to sacrifice his son. That's what he grew up knowing. Terach, his father, tried to threw him into a burning fire across, for the Midrash, because he was an idol worshiper. I mean, really, if you look at the Midrash, we have this image of Avraham going through a lot of trauma from his own father. So Avraham's full experience is not one of, he doesn't have the experience of a loving father who's there for him. He has experience of a father who is committed to certain ideas like idolatry. So when Avraham goes ahead, and this is an interesting question, when Avraham was told by God to sacrifice Isaac, maybe it was coming from God for all of the different reasons that we have explored today, or maybe it was a kind of Avraham's own projection onto what God would want, because that was his experience.
It's the tragic repetition of familiar patterns.
Exactly, but the piece of growth is that Avraham, for the first time, finally listens. He's about to do what his father tried to do for him, and instead he listened. He saw, and Vayeira, and it appeared, he actually saw God doesn't really want him to do this, that God wants him to break the cycle of violence and all this.
Beautiful.
Don't do this. So maybe this was an actual development for Avraham and a growth for him.
Yeah, I really like this. I really like those two interpretations taken together. I mean, I think, a lot of times this might sound cliche, but the nature of tests is that passing or failing is not necessarily a binary. And you have, there are clear ways in which Avraham passes and clear ways that he fails. And I think the text, sort of ricochets between the two. I mean, you have this incredible moment. I was just learning this with some college students earlier this week. You have this moment right after the angel tells Avraham to stop, where now God says, and he sort of comes down and says, okay, you've passed the test, great. And then the last verse of the entire story then says, and then Avraham returned down the mountain to Beersheba. And so anyone reading the story, all the commentators, the students are like, wait a minute, where's Isaac? Where is he in this story? And you get all these interesting interpretations. You get, there's one extreme view in the Midrash that suggests that Avraham, actually the angel was too late, and God then had to have a miracle to revive Isaac at some later time. You have less extreme opinions that suggest that after the story, even if in some ways Avraham passed the test, you can imagine Isaac, who at this point is probably a teenager, looking back at his dad and says, no, thank you. You go back to Beersheba. I'm gonna go, more to the north and find some other city to live in. And so you get this moment where, in some ways, and I think this is very true with everything in life, where there are some ways in which, we can pass tests, and some, I think in a very realistic view of the world, sometimes opening one door comes at the potential risk at closing another. And so Avraham clearly fails some sort of test as a father. I think actually, just one more comment, during the story of the Akedah, anytime the Torah has a narrative between a first person narrative between son and father, it says, he said to his son, or he says to his father. And the one exception to that is actually in the middle of the story of the Akedah, right after Isaac asks his dad, hey, we have the wood and the fire, but where is the burnt offering? And the Torah doesn't say his father said to him, it says Avraham said to him. And the Zohar comments that it was in that moment when Avraham was basically willing to go through with the sacrifice that Avraham actually lost the right to call himself a father of Isaac.
Wow.
So we need to conclude. We have been speaking, and I love what Rabbi Daniel did. He just gave legitimacy to both interpretations with a third one. And it reminds me, and we might conclude with this, that reminds me the story of the couple that separately goes to see the rabbi. And when the rabbi meets with the wife, he tells her, or she tells her, the rabbi is going to be a female rabbi. You're right. And then the husband comes and she speaks with the husband and says, you're right. And then the rabbi's wife comes and says, how can you say to this one, he's right, to the other one, she is right? And then the rabbi says,
you're all
you two are right. So with all these ideas, with all these beautiful interpretations, we will wish to the entire community Shabbat Shalom Mevorach, and what a privilege is to share Torah with so wonderful colleagues. Good Shabbos, my friends.
This is a wonderful morning. Thank you both.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.